It was a dramatic day yesterday. The news of Zelensky coming to Britain, the sense of unity in Westminster Hall when he spoke with great, skill in speaking and, a very strong argument. But it does create quite a complicated challenge for the Prime Minister, the British government, about whether it's the right thing to do, whether it's possible and right to supply these planes. And it felt as though Boris Johnson yesterday was not making the Prime Minister's task easier. Is that right?
Definitely, and Ed, you'll remember those moments in Westminster Hall where you have the Lords and the Commons come together for these huge moments where a kind of huge figure like Obama or, someone like President Zelensky will come and address everyone. And, I spoke to some MPs who were moved, really, really moved. Some moved to tears at the kind of passion and the oratory and the sincerity with which Zelensky both thanked the UK for its support, but also pleaded for more assistance. And that's certainly, there is a very complicated decision to be made about the tactics. So obviously, it takes a lot of training to upskill and ensure that the fighter jets can be used very effectively. But also, there is obviously the fear of escalation here. So these are not easy choices for the Prime Minister.
Do we take that fear of escalation seriously, Kevin? Because we've heard it before. We've heard threats before for any kind of support, haven't we? But that menace there is present, isn't it?
It is present because, of course, Russia's armed with nuclear weapons. Putin has sort of threatened them in the past, but I think we've crossed a point now where they seem empty threats. And if you're supplying missiles and you're supplying tanks, what is fundamentally different about supplying aircraft? If they're going to only operate within Ukraine and they're not going to go into Russia itself, they're not going to attack Moscow. But like, Zelensky's a brilliant politician because he's got such pressure. He's a warrior leader. He's come along and he said, "Great, thanks for everything, but now I want more."
And
there was no way Sunak could say no.
There's a great clip which we should just look at in terms of the brilliance of his politics. The bit, Jack, where he is presenting the helmet to the Speaker of the House of Commons.
And I will explain. It's the helmet of a real Ukrainian pilot. He is one of our most successful aces, and he's one of our kings. And the writing on the helmet reads, "We have freedom, give us wings to protect it."
I mean, it's
poetic.
hard to say no to that, isn't it? It's poetic, it's visceral, the helmet there, the fight sort of brought to Westminster.
Right.
What would be the argument of the difference between planes and tanks and weapons?
Well, I think it's always been this question about how do you help Ukraine to defend its territory? And the conversation has moved from that defensive conversation, tanks, that kind of thing, anti-air surface missiles, that sort of thing helps to protect Ukrainians. And then you're moving to the conversation of how do you get on the offensive? And that is the fear about escalation, because fighter jets,
Why are planes a difference? What is the risk of planes seeming to be different?
I think there is. It's partly. It is true that it does take years to train the pilots. They're worried about that.
Although Boris Johnson pointed out that the Polish pilots in the Second World War, didn't he?
But
they trained up very quickly.
They were different kind of planes, weren't they?
OK.
It's
technicality.
A Spitfire and a Hurricane isn't a Typhoon or an F-35.
It also means that you're putting...
it's just ridiculous.
I think you're putting crew on the ground to service the planes. You'd have to have, kind of people actually there in the theatre from the UK, from NATO.
Which is the difference, is it?
I think
hardware, not people.
I think it's what Anita said, that they'd be worried about whether they would end up in incursions over borders into Russia.
Yeah.
But it's. I mean, the only way for Ukraine to succeed is to go on the offensive. But backing the offensive so overtly looks like NATO and Britain, Germany, France, all becoming part of the fight with Putin, part of the war, as opposed to supporting Ukraine's war. And I would think there'll be loads and loads of diplomatic pressure on the Prime Minister not to take this step. Of course, Boris Johnson will know all of that.
Yeah, but Boris Johnson has changed.
Totally mischievous.
Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, let's not forget he was Prime Minister up until September, didn't send tanks. Tanks are going in.
Let alone planes.
He didn't planes, and he wasn't calling for Ukraine to be allowed into NATO, which he is now. Of course, he also advocates that Ukraine should be in the European Union, which he said was fundamentally undemocratic when he took Britain out. But on the question of planes, Downing Street and the Ministry of Defence have made quite clear they don't want to send them. Or they've made up until yesterday, and they've said it's impractical for lots of reasons, and it is because of all that servicing you have to do, and the avionics and the armaments, and you need a huge crew around a plane. And the RAF has got 100 Typhoons that can fly, 30 F-35s, about £100 million a piece before you start looking after them and arming them. And, of course, they won't want to lose them in truth. They say there are too few for the UK. Now, you can argue, what do they do in the UK? We're unlikely to be attacked. Why not put them to...
On the wider point,
I can see that.
On the wider point, though, are we now actually de facto? Is Britain really at war now with Russia?
I wouldn't like to say so, because I think that would be a huge kind of provocation. And I think the thing that the UK has done incredibly well is not just arming, and obviously the Ukrainians have been incredibly savvy, very smart about picking up these new technologies and making the best use of tanks, for instance. But the reality of the situation is such that the UK has been leading the international effort. And the most important thing is not that the UK is out in front of all the other countries and distinct to them. It's that it keeps moving the Europeans along. And the work that was done, for instance, around tanks, where the UK went first and persuaded the US, and then we've got the Leopard 2s coming from Germany, that's the kind of thing that's
But
really...
they're all on the not at war side of the line.
Yes, and I think it's important that the UK stays with that, because it's moving everyone gently along. But the alliance in Europe and in the US is what's absolutely crucial to ensuring that the Ukraine eventually succeeds.
The UK knew Germany and the US were going to move when the tanks went. And I think there'll be great reluctance to send aircraft if nobody else is. And the Typhoons, I think, are jointly built and licensed with, is it Italy, Spain, Germany? So you'd need permission.
General approval.
For them to go.
Look, you know...
And more than that, it's actually that there's not one kind of fighter jet that everyone in the West uses. Yeah. So actually there is a lot of complexity about... Yeah. It's not interchangeable. Sure. So it would be some countries kind of going off by themselves, which can be...
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely complicated, and we're going to be talking about it all morning. But talking of international calls, we know the Turkish president has called for help, and we've all seen those absolutely devastating scenes each day.